We got to the point of the first of the three elements of war crimes. Those elements, just to repeat again, are the existence of an armed conflict, the violation of the laws and customs of war, and the nexus between the crime and the armed conflict, the link. Now, firstly, the armed conflict. What exactly is it, and what's the threshold for proving it? Now, the term armed conflict has replaced war as the threshold for application of war crimes law. Not every single form of physical confrontation, even violent, between organized groups amounts to an armed conflict. States wanted to keep sovereignty over what they saw were their internal affairs. As a consequence, riots and terror campaigns, such as in the UK, the IRA bombing campaign in the 1970s and 80s, these fall outside the scope of armed conflict. Instead, the test is a relatively narrow one, but which can be interpreted broadly. Now, in the Tadic jurisdiction decision, the ICTY, which tended to explain and set out quite a well-known standard for this, it stated that an armed conflict may be said to exist whenever there is a resort to armed force between states, or protracted armed violence between governmental authorities and organized armed groups, or between such groups within a state. Now, obviously, that gives certain clues to what the requirements are, but there are three groups there, effectively. The first is between states, the traditional type of conflict. The second is between the government and a rebel force, rebel group within a state. And thirdly is between groups, between rebel groups within a state. Now, this standard applies on the entire territory as soon as the threshold is reached. It applies to bigger states and small ones, and obviously international and internal armed conflicts, although that's different criteria for each. Now, many conflicts these days do fall into the latter category of internal armed conflicts. There used to be somewhat old-fashioned, anachronistic, formal declarations of war between states. But even now between states, there are conflicts that occur surreptitiously with people not wanting to make formal declarations. I mean, back in the old days in World War II, on the 1st of September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, there was a formal declaration of war by the UK and France. This compares quite strangely with the current situation, where even in international armed conflicts, as I say, there may well be less than clear formal declarations of war, and many internal armed conflicts when there is never any declaration. Now, in relation to the armed conflict definition I just referred to, there are certain provisions in the ICC statute which clearly seek to limit exactly what an armed conflict is, and therefore, as I mentioned earlier, maintain control for a national state over certain activities or actions on the territory of that state which don't amount to an armed conflict. As a consequence, in ICC, in the Article 8(2)(d) of the ICC statute, Article 8 covering war crimes, the definition of an armed conflict excludes situations of internal disturbances and tensions, such as riots, isolated and sporadic acts of violence, or other acts of a similar nature. Now, as I mentioned, this would exclude a terror campaign such as the IRA in the UK or ETA in Spain. Similarly, Article 8(3) of the ICC statute sets out that nothing earlier in that paragraph describing what actually amounts to an armed conflict shall affect the responsibility of a government to maintain or re-establish law and order in the state, or to defend the unity and territorial integrity of the state by all legitimate means. Obviously, this protects the ability of a state to do what it considers necessary to re-establish law and order when there has been some level of armed violence within a state, but not rising to the level of an armed conflict. Now, what's the relevance of the distinction between internal and international? The main one is what exact law is applicable. And moving on, the scope of the prohibited conduct or the extent of the regulations. Namely, in international armed conflicts, there are much more detailed provisions as to what is prohibited and what is not, rather than in internal armed conflicts where the provisions are less developed and less extensive. Now, that distinction still exists. If you look at Article 8 of the ICC statute, there are still very clear distinctions between an internal armed conflict and what is applicable, the body of law that is applicable to an internal armed conflict, and the body of law that is applicable to an international armed conflict. However, in reality, the distinction between the two does seem to be disappearing as the regimes grow ever more similar. So, although there is a distinction and they are covered by two separate provisions or two separate sections of Article 8 of the ICC statute, many acts are crimes both in internal and international armed conflicts. The reason for this removal of this distinction, if you like, has been the move from a sovereignty-orientated approach whereby the rights and interests of states were paramount in the creation of international law. And therefore, states' interests in being able to protect and preserve order within their countries has fallen by the wayside slightly and been replaced by a more human being-orientated, human rights-orientated approach. And this has been led by jurists such as Antonio Cassese, who in several seminal judgments at the ICTY really sought to remove the distinction between the two. However, there is still a difference and different rules apply. And so as a consequence, I'll just describe the different types of conflict. An international armed conflict is obviously between states. There's no need for cross-boundary violence, and there's no minimal level of intensity. It can be initiated by a bombing mission, even in the absence of a formal declaration of war. In addition, you can have an internal armed conflict which is transformed into an international armed conflict once there is a degree of involvement and control from the external state over the forces in the territory of another state. This test is again from the Tadic jurisdiction decision and is recognized as a test of overall control, whether the external state exercises overall control over the forces within another state. In the former Yugoslavia, this issue arose quite often where in, say, Bosnia, you would have Bosnian Croat forces and they would be supported and potentially under the overall control of external states. In that situation, Croatia. You also had the same situation with the Bosnian Serbs and them being under the overall control of the former Yugoslavia, of Serbia as it is now. And in applying that test, certainly it was considered that overall control is easier to prove once you have a neighboring state who has territorial ambitions within that state. So it would be easier to prove the existence of overall control between Bosnian Croats and Croatia, where Croatia borders Bosnia and at the time sought to annex part of it, as opposed to states which are further away. Now, For internal armed conflicts, this is defined negatively. It's essentially those that are not international. Now, it was originally a more limited regime due to state sovereignty concerns, as I mentioned. Now, it has two elements, intensity and organization. This comes from the phrase that I used earlier, protracted armed violence. The intensity must be at a certain level to distinguish it from banditry or short-lived revolts. It's a very sensitive issue within states who don't want to admit often that there is a full-blown armed conflict within their state, within their territory, essentially because that recognizes that they have lost control over part of their territory, and also in many ways serves to legitimize the actions and the interests of the rebelling force, the opposing force within the country. So states are very reluctant to accept the existence of an armed conflict. But there are various evidential factors which can demonstrate that existence. The presence or involvement of United Nations as a mediator, as someone to seek to control the situation between the parties. The number of troops on either side. Obviously, the greater number of troops, the greater chance of the existence of an internal armed conflict. The number of casualties, the length that the situation has been going on. To take one example, one obviously very present example in Syria, at the beginning was not an internal armed conflict, and at a certain point, with the length of the situation continuing, developed into one. At exactly what point that was, that would obviously have to be a question for detailed analysis, but it can transform from internal riots or disturbances to an internal armed conflict. Now, as a consequence, there must be this level of intensity, but there also must be a level of organization within the rebel force. On the government side, obviously that organization exists from the state, but in the rebel side you need to prove the exercise of responsible command, the exercise essentially that they are able to apply the rules of IHL, of international humanitarian law, the ability to prevent crimes, to disseminate information, and what the standards are. Now, once that armed conflict, that internal armed conflict exists, this triggers the application of the laws of war and potentially gives rise to the application of war crimes as and when those offences are committed. So just to conclude on this part, an international armed conflict exists whenever there is resort to armed force between two or more states. And a non-international armed conflict, or an internal armed conflict, exists when there are protracted armed confrontations occurring between governmental armed forces and the forces of one or more armed groups, or between such groups arising on the territory of a state. The armed confrontation must reach a minimum level of intensity, and the parties involved in the conflict must show a minimum level of organization.